So hello.
Hi.
Listeners of our podcast, and will remember Adriana Garriga-Lopez, who is one of our faculty in BISR Network, usually teaching courses out in Michigan, but this summer teaching a course in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Say hi, Adriana.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. And we did a podcast almost a year ago, or just about maybe a little more, a little less than a year ago, also on Puerto Rico, is particularly in the context of ecological change, colonialism, and general politics in this moment after the hurricanes. This past week, there's been a lot, I'd say actually more than a week, there's been a lot happening politically in Puerto Rico, and Adriana's been doing one of our classes there. And so I thought it would be good to sort of record a little bit, get a little bit of a view from both from the ground, but also from the perspective of someone who's literally teaching and studying sort of colonial power, political change, how things are working from that perspective as well. And so welcome, and I hope people get something out of this. So Adriana, real fast, and I'm going to sort of play, always displaying the modes of the means of production. So I'm going to play interviewer here for the purposes of this being a relatively short recording. Adriana and I are doing this over the internet quickly, and so it's a little scratchy. We both apologize. So Adriana, how would you characterize this? When I was putting this the little list of words together, I had uprising, mass movement. In the news, I think they just say protest or something like that. How do you characterize what's been happening in Puerto Rico?
I would characterize what's been happening in Puerto Rico as a rebellion.
Oh, good.
I think you can talk about it in many ways, depending on the frame that you use to analyze what's going on and the roots of it. But I think really the most accurate word would be rebellion, because even though it's based on decades and decades of community activism, the reality is that the protests were quite spontaneous, and that the success of the protest basically came from people's the indignation that people felt after reading the governor's chat, and after the handful of arrests that had taken place in days prior to the leaking of the chat. It was really kind of the confluence of events that led people to say no more, and just take the streets, and then stay in the streets for 15 days. So people say it was 12 or it was 2 weeks. It was actually exactly 15 days from the Friday when the chats were leaked, and then the Saturday everybody was reading the chats, and then on Sunday the governor came back, and that was the first protest. Everybody, there was a group of people that met the governor at the airport, and then went to his mansion to Fortaleza to protest. And from there, every night after that, every day and every night after that, there were protests at Fortaleza and several other places as well, where the governor was meeting with people. People just showed up and said, you can't go anywhere without confronting people that are expressing their indignation. So in that way, it was really a horizontal movement. There were no big leaders. I mean, there were people who were important leaders and have been doing work for a long time. So a lot of people know them and value their opinion and listen to them and things like that. But there was no one person that was in charge of what was going on, and there was no one group that was in charge of what was going on. And in fact, there were a number of significant community activists and leaders who were out of the country at the time. And so that produced a really interesting dynamic, where there was this kind of horizontalism in the protests, which in places like Puerto Rico, where there's lots of protests and a long history of protests, there can be a lot of hierarchies and, staged kind of structures to protesting. And these protests broke with all of that. There were lots and lots of young people at these protests. There were people who would not previously show up to protest.
Is that there be a lot of young people in the protest?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Is that unusual for Puerto Rican protests that there would be a lot of?
It's not unusual for there to be that many, for there to be a lot of young people, but what was unusual or unseen in the past was that there were a lot of young people who were willing to be very confrontational and engage in direct action, and you know, they were gassed by the police numerous times, and these young people just kept coming back. They would disperse for a few minutes and then they would come right back, and you know, in the blink of an eye there was again hundreds of people standing in front of the cops. So it was this demonstration of fearlessness. And then that kept building on itself. That produced a kind of psychic effect that I think, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a psychologist, specialist in psychoanalysis, and she and I were talking about the protest, and yeah, it was this kind of psychic event where the insults, the fear, the rage, the suffering, the hunger that people suffered after Maria, the indignation over the lack of democracy, the lack of political power, the lack of representation, the lack of water, you know, the frustration over climate change. I mean, all of these things seem to condense on the figure of Ricardo Rosseló, who by all intents and purposes was really a illegitimate politician. I mean, never had occupied public office previous to this, and really his only credential was that he was the former governor's son. And it had told some crazy story about how Puerto Rico was about to become the 51st state. And I mean, you know, and that's not just him, that's the pro-statehood party that has fed people that line. So I think it was just this kind of perfect storm, this kind of condensation of forces, and there were some power vacuums. And in that, what we saw was the largest mobilization of Puerto Ricans in our history.
Wow.
And it was an overwhelmingly beautiful thing to experience. You know, there were so many different types of people there. I saw elderly people there, disabled people there, veterans, children. I saw somebody brought a goat. There was, I don't know, there was someone with a goat there one night. You know,
I like goats.
There were people on horses. There were people on kayaks. There were people on motorcycles and scooters and bikes and skateboards, and you know, I mean, just there was this kind of unending demonstration of unity among Puerto Rican people, and in this really this way that we just had never seen before. And we all of a sudden we see masses of people singing the revolutionary anthem. Puerto Rico has two anthems: the official anthem and then the revolutionary anthem. So leftist tradition to sing the revolutionary anthem at protests and major events, funerals and things like that. But I had never experienced that many people singing it at one time.
What's the name of the revolutionary anthem?
It's called the Revolutionary Anthem. Himno Revolucionario. It probably has another name, to be honest with you, but I don't.
I'll try to get someone to put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm sure you can find it. I can sing it to you, but
that's good. It's okay. Not that I don't want to hear you sing. Trust me.
Well, the opening lines of it is say, "Wake up, Boricua. You know, awaken. The time has come."
Nice.
The call has been put forth. So it was the sense that people were responding to this moment in which we collectively were standing up to people who had been benefiting, who had been making money. They had been completely inured to the suffering that people experienced after Hurricane Maria because of their privilege. And not only that, but we're engaging in corruption, and we're engaging in profit-making schemes off of the recovery funds that were supposed to go to the people of Puerto Rico. So the collective indignation of that just turned into this rage that was unstoppable. And at the same time, it was so unstoppable, and it was so coherent that we all knew that we were going to win. There was no doubt. Like, it was an amazing thing. We were just on the street. Week one, we're like, it's just a matter of time. Like, there's no way, because all these people started coming out and saying, asking the governor to resign, and it was, you know, people from his own party, and it was the, you know, every sector, the artists, and then, you know, even I'm no fan of the Catholic Church, but even the Catholic Church, you know, came out and said he should resign, and then the police union said that he should resign, and, you know, once you have the police saying that he should resign, that's when we really knew that we were about to win. So it's this overwhelming feeling that we were all together, that we were all united in a purpose, and that we were going to win. And so that produced this very euphoric atmosphere. And then the musicians showed up. And, you know, Puerto Rico has an incredible musical culture, and it's just unparalleled in my experience. And I mean, I may be a little biased, but then it was just incredibly creative, and you know, there was music everywhere, and you know, people were coming up with really creative chants, and the chants were beautifully feminist and queer. Cool. And they were, you know, one of them was, Ricky, goddammit, sex workers are to be respected. I mean, it doesn't rhyme in English, but it rhymes in Spanish, you know. Ricky, puñeta, la puta se respetan, you know. So there was this kind of this sense that things have changed, that there's a new generation. They have very little to lose. They have grown up in the crisis. They have grown up in the austerity. They survived Maria. They've lost, you know, friends and family members to migration, to the crisis that happened after the hurricane. And they just were not afraid anymore. And so it really became a zeitgeist, you know, a Volksgeist.
Yeah.
And we just knew that it was a question of time, that there was no way that there could be that much collective purpose, and for this person to stay in power. You know, everybody I talked to in those days, the Uber drivers, just everyone that you talked to was indignant. They said this is not okay. You know, in Puerto Rico, culturally, I think the biggest transgression, there were many transgressions, but in those chats and insults, but the biggest one was against the dead. I think that was the one that people were just not willing to tolerate.
Could you say that last one?
The idea that, yeah, the one that people just weren't willing to tolerate were the insults to the dead, the people who died after Hurricane Maria, because there was a joke that one of the governor's friends, or one of the guys, made in the chat about, don't we have any dead bodies lying around to feed our crows? And I don't even know what that really means, but it was obvious to everybody that they were sort of having a laugh about, you know, the dead bodies that were piling up after the hurricane. There was a real serious crisis at the Forensic Science Institute, because there was an overwhelming amount of bodies that were rotting in trailers in the parking lot. I
mean, I remember talking about this, about some of the specifics of the sort of what do people do with the sort of that number of dead bodies when we were talking about Hurricane Maria and its aftermath in our previous conversation. And one of the things that you know, strikes me listening to the way you've been recounting this is a sort of there's like, I'm curious about sort of two connections, or two things that are being drawn on. Like, one, like how much you were saying you were emphasizing that it's so like spontaneous and very, very horizontal, and this very sort of euphoric sort of crowd spirit, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious though, because at that time you had talked about that there was actually a lot of new and different and organizing going on. I'm curious if there are sort of connections between that moment and this moment, other than this sort of just general like, fuck it,
yes,
I'm so sick of this shit.
Yeah. No, of course, that's yeah, of course. That's, I meant to say, you know, I got lost in my own reminiscing, but There's some beautiful days there. You know, it's easy to be nostalgic even so quickly, although it's not over yet. Yes, absolutely. This would not be taking place without, like I said, you know, decades of community organizing, and you know, from all different sectors, from the labor sector, the women's movement, the queer movement. Really, the women's movement and the queer movement were at the forefront of this particular event. That was part of what made it so cool and so inspiring. And it really reflects a different perspective, I think, that a new generation has about these things, which is, you know, if you look at somebody like Bad Bunny, the reggaeton artist who was involved in the protest, who just flew from Spain to participate in one of the protests, and then flew back to Spain to finish his concert tour, and then decided to put his career on pause to stay in Puerto Rico and protest and be part of the movement. You know, I mean, Bad Bunny is somebody who's been part of his aesthetic as a mass media artist has been a queer aesthetic. Has been, you know, he's had long nails. He paints his nails. He wears some makeup sometimes. He's, you know, kind of a John Elton figure in terms of his use of fashion, and kind of a playful queerness. You know, I don't know anything about his personal life, but just in terms of his aesthetic, right? Just he's clearly pushing a kind of genderqueer aesthetic in what has been an extremely heteronormative and homophobic musical environment, which is the reggaeton and kind of hip hop, you know, hip hop adjacent dance hall kind of world, you know, in the Caribbean. So I think there has been a change in the way that young people understand gender violence and sexual liberation. And one of the chants of the protest is there is no political liberation without sexual liberation. There's no political freedom without sexual freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say, like, when I was listening to you recount, like, it's really interesting to sort of hear the synthesis of like a very traditional sort of anti-colonial, or traditional is maybe the wrong word, but like what we might remember from a certain kind of period of like sort of national liberation, sort of revolutionary, that kind of language, but really synthesized with all kinds of like queer liberation, feminist liberation.
Yes, and that has been so cool.
And like when you think about it, like with your sort of theoretical hat or with your anthropology hat, like how do you see that working even, or like not how it work? I can see it working pretty easily, but like is that coming together, or is it sort of very ad hoc and it's just gonna sort of fall apart?
No, I think, you know, I think there's two things. One is the influence of the internet and the availability of you know, Black feminist discourse and cultural production that young women and young feminists in Puerto Rico have access to, as well as a very long history of solidarity and collaboration and cooperation between, you know, third world feminists, Puerto Rican feminists, Latin American feminists, Black feminists in the U.S., indigenous feminists as well. So I think, you know, there's a long history of activism that has been also nurtured even more by digital connections and the availability of cultural material. And I also have to say that the feminist groups here and the queer groups here in Puerto Rico have done a very systematic job of trying to do political education camps and workshops and outreach and you know, videos online, sort of fora where people are explaining what is intersectionality, what's the relationship between feminism and anti-racism. You know, that kind of work has been being done. I don't even know if that makes any sense. Has been done by queer feminist groups in Puerto Rico, and so I think, you know, it's not right to say that people are protesting the chats or that this is just the result of the chats, precisely because there's been a very... Sorry, I was saying that the feminist and queer groups in Puerto Rico have been doing this kind of political education work very systematically. And so that has really laid a lot of the foundations for this kind of queer radicalism that has been a central part of these protests.
So that sort of like characterizes the protests like in that sort of like 15-day period that you were talking about. Like, what do you see, like, what are the prospects of this going further, like into some of the sort of structural issues and the sort of broader colonial situation with the rule by board, rule by sort of direct technocratic rule, things like that, that Puerto Rico has been struggling through for, as you said, decades and decades and decades.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it remains to be seen how far it will go. But what is clear is that this is a historical moment that has changed the way that Puerto Ricans feel about their role in the political destiny of Puerto Rico. There's a renewed sense of hope. There has been a notable change in the usage. You know, people were using the black and white Puerto Rican flags as a symbol of resistance, and you can still see those are still being used, but there's been also a very deliberate use of sort of repainting those black and white flags, repainting them blue and red and white. So there's just kind of a symbolic transformation that I think is irreversible. You know, Puerto Ricans have always been characterized as docile. The docile Puerto Rican is a famous essay written by, you know, a Puerto Rican intellectual, this image of the docile Puerto Rican, that we were never able to overthrow, you know, imperial rule, that we were kind of subservient to the Americans, and like the white lamb that is part of the Puerto Rican, ¿cómo se dice? El escudo, what's the thing that you protect against swords? Like, you hold it up and you protect against swords. You know what I'm saying? A shield, yes. Like the Puerto Rico, the state shield, the Puerto Rico state shield has a white lamb in the center.
Oh, wow. I like
and
that.
so, you know, we have been that white lamb, right? There were people, there were artists and people who were sort of saying that we need to change that lamb and turn it into like a goat, or, you know, people were proposing different things that how we should change that, because that's that. I don't know who that was, why they brought a goat, but it was like amazing to see that.
No, like somehow
I feel kind of bad for the goat.
So just sort of like two other things to ask here. One is, like, you know, you are teaching this class on feminism, on colonialism, on these things right now. So, like, how is it for the class that I think you just finished, right, this week?
Yeah, yesterday was my last night.
Class. Were people like making connections? Like, I'm just curious, like what that experience was like.
Oh my goodness, it was an incredible privilege to be engaged in a space of reflection for the month of July 2019 in San Juan, Puerto Rico, with a bunch of wonderful, brilliant, revolutionary young feminists, as well as a couple of friends of mine who are my age, and also a friend of mine who's in her 70s. And so this is this really unique intergenerational, you know, queer feminist space to talk about sovereignty, food sovereignty, agricultural projects, and feminism and queer theory. And then these protests started happening, and we were all, you know, all of my students were involved in some way, every single one. And we were attending these protests, and we were meeting up at the protests, and then we would come to class and we would talk about the protests in relationship to the reading. And it was like real time
testing ground, I guess.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was like, you know, it was like spend the day in the struggle, and then be able to go and reflect with the comrades at night, you know. it was really moving, actually. And these young, I mean, most of them were young people. They're in their early 20s or mid to late 20s, and they were really inspiring and really fired up, and just super critical and very able to dialogue with each other and sort of take into account each other's positionalities and viewpoints and differences. And I was inspired by that, and the material that I had put together for us worked well. You know, we read Arturo Escobar's Sentí Pensar con la Tierra, which is translated in English to, I think, the Pluriverse. So we were really trying to, you know, apply some of those concepts, like, for example, Sentí Pensar, which is like thinking, feeling, like how to think feel, not just think, but think, feel, right? Sort of using feeling and emotion and sensation as part of thinking, right? Understanding that as part of thinking, and then relating that to how we can be in the earth, or how we can be with the earth, and think about our ontologies, right? Our radical ontologies that we're capable of constructing in the middle of all this madness that we're living on this planet. So it was we had some really deep conversations, and there were some, also my students twice requested that the class be moved to a different day because there were protests that were, you know, there were national strikes that had been called for, you know, the second Monday and the third Monday. So we ended up meeting on Tuesdays that week. And I was like, sure, you know, I'm not gonna, like, nobody's gonna come, you know. But then it was really cool because the class became a space where we could reflect on what had happened the previous day. And we were kind of, you know, putting some of these ideas to test as we went along in the class, thinking about what does decolonization mean, how is decolonization related to the body, how is decolonization related to sexuality. And one of the coolest things that happened at the protest, it was very divisive for some people, especially, I guess, religious people who felt offended, but for the rest of us, it was great to see what was called El Perreo Intenso en la Catedral, which is right in front of the San Juan Cathedral. This queer and feminist bunch of people basically were twerking and, I don't know, dirty dancing is the best thing I can do as far as translation goes. You know, perreo is like dancing reggaeton in a very, like, sexy way. Okay. So, yeah, so in front of the cathedral, you know, there were these people. There was a young woman in a bikini that was in a Puerto Rican flag bikini, and she was twerking, and then there were, like, you know, gay people and trans people dancing and twerking on the stairs, and there was a lot of people there. It was at night, and it was all happening to reggaeton, which is, despite it being a ubiquitous music in Puerto Rico and known worldwide as Puerto Rican music, here in Puerto Rico is looked down on, and it's thought of as a déclassé, or, you know, working class music, right? So, or as you know, bad music because it's about sex and things like that. So, but it's also looked down on by people on the left, the bourgeois left, if you will, who can't tolerate the sort of, you know, popular mass culture of reggaeton, you know. So it's this really interesting statement from a queer community that would not necessarily be accepted even by, you know, the reggaeton culture, but we all grew up with that music. So, you know, it was saying something about asserting our right to be who we are, instead of enacting these very hypocritical cultural attitudes about sexuality, about music, about the body, about our culture, and pretending like it's something other than what it really is. So, you know, there were those moments that were kind of beautiful cultural poetics that just crystallized the feeling that we've had enough, that we're not going to tolerate this crap anymore, and that we're going to stop pretending to be something other than who we are. And that was, you know, elaborated in various ways throughout those 2 weeks, and I think it's continuing to be elaborated. And I don't think people are done protesting. I think that things are going to continue to heat up. We are expecting the governor to leave his office this Friday.
Mm-hmm.
I guarantee you there's going to be a large mobilization on Friday. We don't know who's going to be the next governor of Puerto Rico yet. Whoever it is up against a massive undertaking and very low confidence in the population for the pro-statehood party, who are the ones that have to pick a successor. And in fact, there are FBI investigations that are running. People have been charged. Secretary of Education Julia Kelleher, who you may remember I talked about the last time we talked about Puerto Rico. Julia Kelleher has been charged with 32 counts of fraud. Así que yes, we're looking forward to seeing her meet her justice. And she's not the only one. There are other people who were integral to this administration who were engaged in illegal activities, and we know it. And so we need support for the press, for the local press in Puerto Rico. The Center for Investigative Journalism, CPI, the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, have been doing an amazing job. I mean, they have received awards already. I'm sure they'll receive many more because their investigations have been key to uncovering the corruption scandals as well as the sort of intricate web of disasters that was the Maria recovery. And they are just a small team of very, very dedicated, very serious reporters. And so I think that's definitely someplace that people should support if they want to support people in Puerto Rico. They should also support Agitarte, which is where my class took place in Santurce. Agitarte is like Agit Arte, right? So they're a group of, they do agitprop, you know. They're a bunch of artists that do like theater, political theater, and street theater and puppetry, and they do amazing work. Look them up on Facebook. And La Colectiva Feminista is the group, La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, the feminist collective under construction, is one of the groups that has been central to this. And also a place called the Hangar, El Hangar in Santurce, en La Sombrilla Queer. Those are the queer groups that have been also at the center of these mobilizations. But there's been many people, you know, university students, and the university strikes were absolutely fundamental. They were the schools that these young people, the revolutionary schools that educated these young people who were so brave. We wouldn't be here without the kinds of community organizing that took place after Maria, which we had talked about also a year ago. The kind of community organized kitchens, the kind of mutual aid societies that sprung up after Maria. The fact that people had to fend for themselves, they had to clear their own roads, they had to find their own water, they had to help their neighbors. You know, those experiences are the ones that really laid the foundations for what feels like a really profound political transformation, which has yet to realize itself in institutional transformation, but which no doubt, there's no doubt, has transformed the way that Puerto Ricans feel about ourselves, about our political future, about our capacity to determine our political future. And the children, the young people that have been witness to this massive uprising will live their lives knowing that that when Puerto Ricans want to do something, we do it. And it's amazing to go from like, you know, oh, sob story, abandoned colony of the world, to 2 weeks later, you know, people around the world looking at us going like, oh, we should be more like Puerto Rico.
Exactly. I mean, so that's in some ways you've anticipated with both by talking about all those organizations and also with this sort of reflection. What the sort of last thing I was going to say, because I do really think a lot of people have been looking at Puerto Rico in this moment and a year ago, and sort of just Puerto Rico has been much more visible in this past, in this past period. And I know that there's definitely people probably who want, not just probably, there are people, they exist outside of Puerto Rico, right, in the continental U.S., but in other countries as well, who want to support Puerto Rico. So beyond, or it could just be that to support those groups, but to support what's happening in Puerto Rico, to be in solidarity, what would you say is some things people could be thinking about doing or doing?
I think there's a lot of ways to help. There's a lot of ways that people can help. There are people who are coming to Puerto Rico, including a young man I met an Indian man I met who came from New York. With no prior connection to Puerto Rico, just decided that he wanted to be part of what was going on, and
that's some solid
over here.
old school revolutionary shit from 100 years ago.
That's right. And I was happy to receive him, and we saw eye to eye very quickly. And so I think that's happening. People are coming to Puerto Rico to participate in the movement. It's becoming a movement. It has to articulate itself better, collectively, to be able to really be a movement, but I think we're going to get there. So we people are, I think, revolutionary comrades are welcome. Cruise boat tourists, we don't need any more of those. There's glorious days in Old San Juan when the cruise ships stopped docking because of the protest. And for the first time in the last 20 years of my life, I could enjoy Old San Juan without thousands of American tourists walking around. It was an incredible feeling to just be like, it's ours again, So anyway, whatever, tourists are welcome. But of course, there's a need for people who have logistical knowledge or who have the ability to support. They can find ways to integrate themselves into what's happening, with the understanding that so far this has been, like I said, pretty much a leaderless movement, a very horizontal movement. So if you come here looking for the leader, you're not going to find them. But if you find people that need help for some project, then I'm sure your help would be welcome. Cool. You can send money, like I said, to organizations that are doing really important work, like the CPI, the CPI, Agitarse, La Colectiva. Like I said, there's many other groups that are worthwhile recipients, as well as financial aid. You can also agitate in the United States for the release of our political prisoners, in particular Nina Droz, whose birthday it is today, I believe. She turned 39 years old today. She's been in prison for, I think, about 3 years. For supposedly trying to set a bank on fire during a May 1st protest, but we know that this was really a way of trying to intimidate the movement and people who, they used her as a symbolic figure, and she's been unjustly imprisoned. So we demand her release, and we want Nina Droz to be able to come home, and we certainly need help visibilizing her case, and people in the United States can help us do that, and can put pressure on legislators and people in power to visibilize her case, and as well as those of other political prisoners. I think that people always get excited when there are expressions of solidarity from people of color in the United States, from radical communities who can articulate what they see when they look at us, and how we're connected. People read those things and they comment them, and they feel inspired by them. Especially
it's not just words; it actually means something.
Yeah, but because the thing is that in the liberal media, the way these protests are talked about is just complete bullshit. It's as though we were in agreement with Trump. Which most of us are not. No, because Trump was not a fan of the governor.
Oh, I see. Yes, of course.
So the idea was that, because Trump had called out the governor's corruption, that he had somehow inspired these protests, which is absolutely absurd.
That's insane.
It's completely absurd, but it's one of the narratives that has circulated.
Wow.
Or the idea that people are just reacting to the indignation from the chats, which again is obscures the 122-year history of U.S. colonialism and military invasion in Puerto Rico, and everything that has happened during that time, including the persecution, imprisonment, and assassination of Puerto Rican leftists and nationalist leaders, and the murder of students, the persecution, like I said, of feminist activists as well as independence activists. You know, so against the kind of whitewashing of these protests, or the sort of incredibly inane idea that these are American citizens expressing their, you know, enacting their constitutional rights. I mean, Puerto Rico is, because it's a territory, does not have the U.S. Constitution does not apply in full to Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So
irony of ironies for then Americans, U.S. Americans, to say that Puerto Rican protests are actually a kind of vindication of the U.S. Constitution. Another complete absurdity. I don't think people appreciate that kind of pity discourse about, oh, they're American citizens too, and they deserve better. Nobody here enjoys that or likes it, and everybody thinks it's insulting. But what people, you know, people love hearing from Angela Davis, people love hearing from the Black Lives Matter movement, they love hearing from indigenous folks, they love hearing from other people who have been in struggle against U.S. colonialism. You know, we know that our brothers and sisters in Hawaii have been standing up to U.S. colonial power. We know that brothers and sisters in the Mariana Islands have also been protesting and rising up against U.S. colonial power. You know, if people are familiar with, you know, Black politics and Black struggles in the United States here in San Juan for the most part. And there's a little bit of awareness also about, you know, things like Standing Rock and indigenous struggles for sovereignty. So when we get messages from those groups, it feels like, okay, these folks really know what we're going through, you know, like they're not just saying, oh, these poor American citizens, they're actually understanding the complexity of American citizenship as a colonial imposition, and a colonial imposition that produces then a second-class citizenship. Yeah. So citizenship in this case is really the vehicle of colonial power. And so when people say, oh, these are U.S. citizens, how could they be treated like that? Well, we're U.S. citizens who live in a colony. And so therefore citizenship is actually, you know, the vehicle for colonization. Ironically, if we were to, for example, remove the shipping laws, the ones that impose extremely high taxes on goods that are Hello?
I'm sorry, I was saying the Jones Act and things like that?
Yeah. So the Jones Act is not just the shipping laws. The Jones Act is also the first organic act in Puerto Rico that actually gave Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship in 1917. And there was another organic act that was established by the constitutional process in 1948 to 1952. But there is a question, to my mind, if we were to overturn the Jones Act for Puerto Rico, which it actually wouldn't just be for Puerto Rico, it'd be for Puerto Rico and the other territories, because Congress would have to make a determination about those laws in relationship to the territories as a whole. More than likely, I suppose they could make an exception, but I don't see why they would do that, make an exception for Puerto Rico, right? If we were to repeal those laws, then potentially, arguably, U.S. citizenship might also be at stake. So there's a lot of different ideas and positions and opinions about that. Some of us are willing and would be happy to give up our U.S. citizenship in favor of Puerto Rican citizenship. But that's not true for everyone here in Puerto Rico. So, you know, these are really complex questions. I think people are asking them. People are also asking really radical questions like, why do we even need a government? Right? Like, why can't we govern ourselves in a different way? Why do we need to follow this particular pattern? You know, why does it have to go through these parties? Why do we need parties at all? You know, I mean, I've heard people ask those questions explicitly in the last few weeks. Because I think, you know, it's really been a dream come true for me personally. I can't begin to express the amount of emotion that I have felt and shared with my friends and loved ones, and just bawling in the street, you know, in the middle of these protests, just like crying out of joy and out of anger and out of frustration and sadness and all of it at the same time, and just also feeling very proud of Puerto Rico and proud of my people and lucky to be here. I mean, what a coincidence that I was able to be here, that I had planned to teach this class at this time. And also, like I said, an incredible privilege to be directly in communication with these young folks, you know, who were part of my class and who really exemplified in many ways the young people who were at the forefront of these protests. And so it's been an incredible month of July, and August is shaping up to be quite something as well. We have the governor's resignation expected for August 2nd. So we saw more arrests from the FBI today for fraud. And we also, just before I got on here with you, I read an article from a journalist, from the journalist who first released the chat. She posted a Facebook Live tonight saying that she has another 100 pages that are much worse than the first chats that were leaked. So it's like still happening.
Yeah, of course.
It's like,
well, I just really want to, I mean, so this has been amazing to hear all this, and these sort of reflections, and sort of putting it also in some of these historical contexts and in these sort of structural contexts of colonization, and also the effects of all these things that we've been talking about, you know, as I said, we said, like periodically, like since Maria and then far before. So thank you so much for taking time to talk tonight, Adriana. And
yeah, I want to say one last thing, which is that one of the first groups, international messages that we received was from Palestinian people in solidarity. So yeah, free Palestine.
Agreed. All right. Have a good night, and people will be listening to this probably just you know, this weekend, hopefully. So it will be in August, and we'll see.
Wonderful.
And yeah, thank you again.
I can't.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I can't wait to see what the future holds for us.
Okay. All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.